Although he was extremely busy, Ansel was generous with his time. I promised I would take less than an hour, and he agreed. We arrived at his home and set up. When I was ready, Virginia, his wife, got him out of the darkroom. I shot 7 frames, which took about 5 minutes. This image happened just as Ansel turned to smile at Virginia. As we were leaving, Ansel noticed my Pentax spot meter. We spent the next 2 hours in the darkroom calibrating it at his suggestion, even though he had no time. I chose the profile because it is different than other images I have seen of him. Ansel told us about breaking his nose in the 1906 San Francisco earthquake. He always planned to have it fixed when he grew up, but since he never grew up, he says, I never got it fixed. I asked him about signing a model release, and he said, you don't need a model release from me. The picture, after all, is yours, and you may use it in any way you choose. Robert Arneson. Bob was my teacher, mentor, and friend beginning in the 60s when I was a sculptor. This portrait of Bob began the series of artist portraits in 1979. I had not seen Bob for 10 years and was told he was battling cancer. I was happy to find when I met with Bob that his cancer was in remission. He was sitting on his wedging table and rubbing the clay off his hands. 6 years later, when I photographed him a second time, he was still healthy and had just fathered a new baby girl. During a conversation with Bob in the late 1980s, he bemoaned the fact that there wasn't the energy in his students that existed in the 1960s when I was at the University of California, Davis, as a graduate student. He asked me the next time I was in town if I'd come speak to his students about making art. I simply said, you're the one that taught me about making art. How could I possibly teach your students anything that you haven't already given them? Clayton Bailey. I first saw the ceramic creatures of Clayton Bailey when they were submerged in a tub of water at the Museum of Contemporary Crafts in New York City. Occasionally these creatures would emit bubbles and come to the surface, then back underwater they would go. Both Clayton and I were included in an exhibit at the museum entitled Clayworks 20 Americans. Clayton used to operate the Wonders of the World Paleolithic Museum in Port Costa and has recently reopened it. The curator was Dr. George Gladstone, who, even when wearing his lab coat and pith helmet, looked strangely like Clayton Bailey. Clayton moved the remnants of the museum to some rooms behind his studio for a while, and we took the tour. It was like the combination of all the horror movies you've ever seen, complete with flashes of miniature lightning that brought to life a skeleton, making it bounce and jiggle all over the table. Clayton was also making robots, some like the one pictured here. He wears and operates, while others are motor-driven. He for a while hired out to parties. Ruth Bernhard. Tried for 6 months to get Ruth to let me make her portrait. When she finally agreed, she explained that she was an 18-year-old girl trapped in a 76-year-old body. After she saw the results of our first session, she invited me back to photograph her again. This time we worked in the studio where Ruth had done all of her own work. What followed was a wonderful collaboration and lesson for me in the use of available light. Just as I was ready to begin making images, Ruth said, I love to look at your eyes over the camera. I retouched the print a great deal, as Ruth preferred soft, flattering portraits. When she saw it, she exclaimed, when I go to the plastic surgeon, I will take this portrait with me. Phil Borges. I caught Phil at a perfect moment as he was working towards a book with Amnesty International of portraits of indigenous peoples from different cultures around the world. The mock-up of the book covered the wall of his work area. He was in the process of signing original prints to fill orders from all over the world. While I was there, he answered the phone for several national magazines and apologized as he had just returned from a trip. After shooting, he shared stories about incidents he had survived photographing in war-torn countries. Edna Bullock. As a portrait of Edna, this picture received a great deal of flack from the feminist movement. Their argument was that Edna is pictured in Wynn's shadow because of all the Wynn Bullock background. Edna said, this is my wall. I put it together and it has special meaning for me. I chose to stand in front of it. Edna's image is my most successful portrait. Edna had several strokes prior to her death. This portrait acted as a grounding point in helping her regain her presence of mind. Near her death, it hung above her bed, helping loved ones remember Edna's wonderful smile. Finally, the print was displayed at her memorial service, and each of her children expressed a desire to have one. Edna didn't start making photographs until after Wynn's death in 1976, her reasoning being one photographer in the family is enough. John Davola. When this portrait was made, John had been photographing interiors of derelict structures. These were mostly houses near the California coast. After painting silver and other colored circles all over the inside, he lit the interiors to match the ambient light outside and made his images in color, sometimes with a sunset through a large window. When we went into his backyard, I picked the side wall of his garage as a place to work. He asked me to wait while he retrieved a can of silver spray paint. He then painted the circle on the boards covering an old window in the garage so that it framed his head when he stepped into the composition. I sensed his discomfort and asked how he felt about the portrait process. John preferred to be represented by his work rather than by a photograph of his face. He felt it was better for the work to stand alone. He put his hand over his face to illustrate his feelings. I asked him to keep it there. Glenn Fishback. I made this photograph of my dad, Glenn Fishback, while he was waiting for a client to show up at a piece of architecture the client had designed. He was going to do an environmental portrait of him in that space, and while he waited, the light just seemed perfect. It was at a point where he was beginning to teach me photography, the very early 60s, 1963. It was he that I learned what the fine print was about and how to make them. He was my father and my teacher. David Gilhooly. I've known David since 1965. In 1966, we curated a show entitled The First Group Mess. We invited several artists to do a piece they had always wanted to do, but had not done for one reason or another. David loved the car he owned at the time. It was a Volkswagen The Thing, and its small size contrasted greatly with his stature. We both felt this would be a great place to pose him. The quote I asked him to give me for a book where I published his portrait and a number of others probably best sums him up. I was born the son of a 49er in the mother lode country of California. All we had to eat were scorpions, and boy, could my mother make a scorpion last for a long time. Academically, I was simply a lousy student. I didn't want to take chemistry or German. Looking back, I know what I wanted was to be independent. I fiercely resented authority and wanted to be famous. Kara. Eben is a woodcarver who lives on the Big Sur Peninsula. His house is on a cliff high above the Pacific Ocean. Eben told us that on a clear day you could see Chile from his living room. He placed his hands on the sculpture in front of him in this portrait in several positions and silently experimented until he had a combination he liked. He put almost as much thought into having his portrait taken as he obviously did in the carving of a piece of wood. Pumped himself up and he reached his peak, and all I had to do was trip the shutter. He has a strong feeling about everything he does. In fact, he at times has carved a piece of wood until a pile of chips is all that is left. Eben was totally in concert with me while making this portrait. Greg MacGregor. I first met Greg at an SPE conference in San Francisco in the late 80s. I later invited him to be a visiting artist at Weber State University in Ogden, Utah, where I was teaching at the time. We decided to put on the first bad art conference, and students in the art department were asked to make bad art. The art made was placed on the ground over a hole we had dug, concealing a quantity of black powder buried in powdered clay. This was circled by crime scene tape on traffic cones. John Philip Sousa marches played on a cassette tape player in a tinny-sounding fashion. Greg, dressed in a gabardine suit from a Goodwill store in Oakland, where he lived, wearing a hard hat and holding a bullhorn, began telling stories about bad art in Paris subways and other places. When he finished, he set off the black powder and the bad art was blown about 60 feet in the air. Then a group portrait was made of all the attendees to commemorate the event. John Sexton. John was Ansel Adams' assistant at the time of this portrait. He lived in the hills above Monterey. Suggested that his environment was the out-of-doors, so we headed further into the Monterey Hills. After hiking around for a while, we came to a clearing. After setting up my camera, I asked him to walk out into the opening in the forest. Basically, I set up to do a landscape, which is John's usual primary subject. When John was in just the right position, I asked him to sit down on the ground in that landscape. It was not until I was finished and John stood up that I noticed that where he was sitting was very wet, and the seat of his pants were soaked. I suggested that he was a very good model to hold still and give me a good expression while sitting in about an inch of water. Wahlberg. Jerry has been concentrating on metal sculpture for many years. At the time of this portrait, he came into the public eye for his Indo Arch, a work commissioned by the city of Sacramento as part of a 2% of construction costs for public art ordinance. Merchants and concerned citizens protested the huge sculpture installation on a site that took 2 years to select. After much public discussion, the city fathers held firm and a 40-foot Corten steel arch went up as scheduled. No matter what position people took, at least they were talking about art. Brett Weston. Prints behind Brett in this portrait are nudes. He had built a special pool with a window below water level, allowing him to photograph nude women swimming. These nudes were unusual for the time because they combined the nude figure with movement and the flowing line of water. Brett posed for me several times through the years. Though he was willing and cooperative, he was never truly there in spirit. Therefore, his image was more a picture than a portrait. Once, while I viewed a large print on his wall, Britt yelled across the room, saying, "You don't stand that close to a 16 by 20-inch print." Cole Weston. The day before I photographed Cole, he was sitting on the deck of his 65-foot ketch, Sculdies, docked in Monterey Bay. We said hello and were asked to come aboard. He was chewing a stalk of celery and asked if we minded if he finished his lunch. We spent the afternoon talking about fathers, sons, and photography. Cole was the youngest son of photographer Edward Weston, who was also the source of my middle name. In 1970, he sailed the Sculdies to the Caribbean, and in 1973 to the South Seas. Cole said they sailed over 40,000 miles on that trip. When Cole talked about his children, his eyes took on a special look. This portrait was made at Cole's Garrapatta Canyon pole house, built for him by his sons. The desk behind Cole was his father's. Edward Weston sat there while writing his famous daybooks. The sign in the cabinet window reads, "I do not lend books to my friends. I do not want to lose either my books or my friends."